A very good morning and welcome you all to this webinar on Towards a New India, Governance Transformed 2014-19, a book written by Shri V. Srinivas, IAS. Center for Good Governance, a Government of Telangana organization, is established in 2001 and working for international organization, Government of India and various state governments in the areas of public administration, reforms and citizen-centric governance, including e-governance. We take pride to organize this webinar on the topic which has direct relevance and bearing on our core mandate. We have 4 esteemed speakers today to deliberate on the subject, and I would like to welcome them to the webinar and introduce to you. Dr. Duri Subbarao, chair of today's webinar, was 22nd Governor of Reserve Bank of India from 2008 to 13, who provided leadership during the global economic crisis 2008-10 and safely stewarded Indian economy. So his background is he stopped civil services exam in 1972 and joined IS in AP cadre. He is finance expert in a journalist service. Dr. Subbarao has obtained his master's in economics from Ohio State University and completed his Humphrey Fellowship at MIT. He worked as finance secretary for AP government. Then he joined Government of India Joint Secretary in Department of Economic Affairs. He was a lead economist at World Bank. Dr. Subbarao worked as additional secretary in Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council in 2005 to 7. He is visiting faculty in National University of Singapore, and Dr. Subbarao is author of the book Who Moved My Interest Rate, Leading RBI Through 5 Turbulent Years. So I welcome you, sir, and I will introduce now our second speaker, Shri G.C. Chaturvedi, IAS. He is chairman of ICICI Bank. He did his Master of Science from London School of Economics, UK, an IAS officer of 77 batch of UP cadre. He worked as additional secretary, Department of Financial Services, and he retired from IAS as the secretary of Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas in 2013. So he was chairman of Warehousing Development and Regulatory Authority of India till January 2018. He was also chairman of Pension Fund Regulatory and Development Authority, Petronet LNG Limited, Indian Strategic Petroleum Reserves Limited, and Oil Securities Development Board. He also worked as Special Director General Finance in Organizing Committee for Commonwealth Games. He was a director on boards of various banks. So a very esteemed speaker, both of them. Welcome, sir. I will introduce now our third speaker today, that is Srimati Sumita Dhabra, IS of 91 batch. Currently, she is Joint Secretary in Department of Industrial Promotion and Internal Trade. She did her MA and MPhil in Economics, MBA from University of Birmingham, UK. She was head of Economic Wing in Indian Mission in Beijing, China from 2011 to 2014. She worked as program specialist in UNICEF, and she is also author of 2 books. First called Poor But Spirited in Karimnagar, and the recent one is China, Behind the Miracle. So welcome, madam. And I would like to introduce today's 4th speaker and author of the book on which we are going to deliberate, Mr. V. Srinivas, IS 1989 batch. He is currently Additional Secretary in Ministry of Personnel, Public Grievances and Pensions, and Director General for National Center for Good Governance. He worked as Chairman of Board of Revenue for Rajasthan and Rajasthan Tax Board. He was also advisor to Executive Director India at International Monetary Fund, Washington, 2003 to 6. Mr. Srinivas is Indian Council of World Affairs Fellow, 2017 to 19, and he is author of 2 books. The first one was India's Relations with IMF, 25 Years in Perspective, and Towards a New India Governance Transformed 2014-19, on which we are going to deliberate. He published several papers and delivered talks on governance reforms post-COVID, role of reforms, innovations, technologies, governance, etc. So I'll take, just before handing over mic to the Chair, Dr. Subbarao Garu, I would like to give an outline of today's discussions. We all have witnessed that India's welfare programs have undergone a massive digital transformation in the past 5 years. We have seen an accelerated pace of transformation with equally important aspect of efficiency in reform implementation, duly recognizing the importance of inclusiveness as part of social sector reforms. Shri V. Srinivas, author of the book, has narrated his real life experiences in various fields of governance. During his tenure as chairman of Board of Revenue, Rajasthan, he traveled more than 8,000 kilometers and interacted with 60,000 farmers, 7,000 advocates and 5,000 officials. The digital transformation in every field of governance witnessed by him was phenomenal. In the book, he covers from social inclusion, healthcare, education, rural development, to India's fight against corruption, yoga, culture and sports, and improving justice delivery systems. Sri Srinivas has also shared his experience of streamlining of internal governance processes, cooperation measures between advocates and benches, and digitization of court work, leading to decadal high adjudication of 13,500 cases and making Board of Revenue Rajasthan to be fully digitalized institution, providing universal access to its court work. The book brings out the much needed optimism and dismantles the arguments of naysayers through a well-articulated thought process. The book is written in a lucid language and is a must-read for policymakers and implementers across the country. So we welcome all the speakers, and I hand over the mic now to the chair, Dr. Subbarao Garu, to please take it forward. I just want to show that this is the book on which we are going to deliberate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Srinivas for inviting me to be part of this book discussion. My thanks also to Rajendra and Shabish Sheikh and their entire team at the Center for Good Governance for involving me in this book discussion. And of course, a matter of pride and privilege for me to be on a panel along with my friends and former colleagues, Girish Chaturvedi and Sumita Dhabra. And I'm also glad that I connected just in time. I want to commend this book by Srinivas for many reasons, but I want to just cite three. The first reason I commend the book is for the vast canvas that is covered. Virtually every program, every scheme, every aspiration of the government is covered in the book, from health and education and skills to yoga and sports to federalism to civil service reforms. It's a go-to book for virtually everything, and I wish I had a book like this when I was preparing for the IAS way back. The second reason I commend the book is for the depth of research that's gone into it. Is dived into government archives, circulars, speeches, orders, etc. And most importantly, what impressed me was that he's spoken to some of the people who are at the frontiers, actually implementing some of the schemes. So that gives us a sense of reality of many of these things. The third reason I commend the book is for the richness of his own personal experiences that Srinivas brings to bear as it reflects on India's opportunities and challenges. Most of us as civil servants get exposed to the reality of India after we've joined the civil service, but Srinivas is different. He was exposed to the reality of India even as he was in school and college, as it describes in the book. And it brings that, and not only that, even after he joined the service, he's never withheld from getting his hands dirty, as indeed is evident from the book, the number of people he's spoken to on the agenda. You just read out the miles is covered and the number of people he's spoken to. So all the richness of that grassroots experience is reflected in this book. The message I take away from this book is that if you want to march towards New India, good governance is important. You can have a grand vision, lofty ambitions, soaring aspirations, imaginative policies, impressive schemes, and even committed politicians. But all of this comes to nothing, counts for nothing if you don't have good governance. And what is required for good governance is an efficient civil service. You know, this book towards New India should make us reflect on our own performance as civil servants. I expect that the nearly 100 participants in this book are mostly civil servants. So I believe that this book will make us reflect on our own performance as civil servants, our sincerity and commitment, our perseverance, our competence, our integrity, and our professionalism, and most importantly, our understanding of the culture of poverty. It's in fact this issue of the need for civil servants to understand the culture of poverty that I want to focus on. Srinivas has written about the JDY scheme, the Jan Dhan Yojana, which is financial inclusion across the country. And it is one of the signal successes of the Modi government. He has also written about how we leveraged on digital technology to take financial sector, the formal financial sector, to the doorsteps of all the households. JDY is a success, of course, but to the extent that there are still drawbacks in implementation of the scheme, I believe it is because the people who implement the scheme do not understand the culture of poverty. And it is this issue of the need for civil servants, need for everyone else working towards a new India, working towards good governance, the need for them to understand the culture of poverty that I want to focus my comments on in the context of financial inclusion. I've worked on financial inclusion for several years as in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, in the Ministry of Finance, as the governor, and I saw many people who were actually involved in implementing financial inclusion had some stereotype views about poverty, which are all wrong. The first stereotype view people have about poverty is that the poor people want access to the formal financial sector because they want a safe avenue for keeping their money. That is a misperception. Poor people want access to financial inclusion because they want access to credit. In fact, access to credit is much more important to poor people than the cost of credit. You know, imagine a pushcart vendor, fruit vendor in a major city in India today. She borrows 5,000 rupees in the morning, has to repay 5,050 in the evening. That's 1% rate of interest per day. That works out, if you compound it, to 500% per year. 500% rate of interest per year seems outrageous, right? It boils her blood. But that poor pushcart vendor will be happy to take that loan at a 1% per day rate of interest, because from her perspective, it evens out. So we need to understand that for poor people, access to credit is much more important than the cost of credit. You know, I've seen many people say that, look, the big corporates in Mumbai and Delhi, they get loans from corporate banks at prime rate. And these poor women are borrowing at 30-35%. But it is not as if we deny these loans at 30-35% to these poor women. They can go to the commercial bank and borrow at 10-11%. They cannot. They're thrown back to the mercies of the moneylender. So the first stereotype people have about poverty is that the cost of credit is the most important thing. It is, of course, important. But what is more important than the cost of credit is the access to credit. The second stereotype view people have about poor and financial inclusion is that the poor people have regular income like us. As Sumita has worked in the World Bank and other international organizations knows, the World Bank defines poverty as earnings of $2 per day. That does not mean poor people earn $2 per day every day. That's an average over time. Their income's low. They're not only low, but they're irregular, uncertain, and unpredictable. Poor people lose their jobs. They have to remain unemployed for a long, long time because they're sick or they've got to take care of somebody else who's sick in their family. Not only is their income low, Not only is it uncertain, unpredictable, and irregular, but their expenditures are lumpy. That is spent on their children's education. That is spent on illness and death in their family. That is spent on weddings and festivals. All this makes their expenditures lumpy. So their challenge is actually to smooth these irregular earnings into a smooth income stream. And this is something we don't understand. We believe that poor people, $2 per day poverty line means that they're earning $2 per day. The third stereotype you people have about poverty and financial inclusion is that the poor people don't have to do any financial planning because they don't have any money to save or plan. It's rich people like us, middle class, upper middle class, rich class, who need financial planning, who need financial advisors. The reality, though, is that it is the poor people who need to do sophisticated financial planning, precisely because they're poor. They've got to smooth their incomes, as I've said. Now, there's a book called Portfolios of the Poor. It's written by a guy called Darrell Collins and 3 other people. What they do is they actually came out in sometime in 2009 or 10. They've taken 1,000 households in each of these countries, Bangladesh, India, and South Africa. They have documented the daily earnings and expenditures of these households on a daily basis every day for 2 years. And that's a rich data. And what they found is very revealing, which is that the poor people do very sophisticated financial engineering. And poor people understand financial planning because it is a fundamental way of everyday life for them. And some of us look at poor people planning their money and believe it is irrational. I did too. For example, if you go to villages, women in villages might have 10,000 rupees. They will lock it up in some broken tin or away from their drinking husbands somewhere, and yet borrow 10,000 rupees from a neighbor. That sounds irrational, right? To simultaneously be borrowing and also keeping back their own savings. From our perspective, that is irrational. But from their perspective, it is a very rational thing to do. Because if your child falls ill at 2 o'clock in the morning and you got to take her to a doctor, travel 50 kilometers in a hired van, where do you get the money? You get the money from the broken tin box where you've saved it. If there's a death in the family suddenly, where do you get the money? You get the money from the broken tin box. So for the poor people, saving and borrowing at the same time is rational, although it might look irrational from our point of view. Securing a job, getting married, begetting children, nourishing and educating your children, having aspirations for their future are universal human goals. The poor people have a present and a future like all of us. They've got to smooth their incomes, they've got to do sophisticated financial engineering. I'm sure that all of you have heard of Ila Bhatt, Seva, from Ahmedabad, and she legendary reputation for getting together the textile workers of Ahmedabad for 6 or 7 decades now. She was on the board of the Reserve Bank of India when I was governor, and she brought a tremendous amount of grassroots sensitivity to bear on Reserve Bank policies. She wrote a book. It's called We Are Poor But So Many, and she gave it to me. I read it directly. Many things that are interesting there. One of the things she writes about is this. She took a vegetable vendor to a bank manager for a loan. The bank manager quizzed the prospective borrower. She quizzed Ila Ben also. And he took all the documents and verified them and told them to come back the following week. The following week, Ila Ben and the vegetable vendor went back to the bank with the new documents. He quizzed them for another 45 minutes or 1 hour, took more documents, and asked them to come back after 10 days with more documents and more proof. They went back, And this went on and on and on for 6 to 7 visits. Until when says that at the end of all this interrogation and interlocution, what I realized was that financial illiteracy is on the other side of the table. So that's about the need for people involved in financial inclusion to understand the culture of poverty. I just want to cite one more example on the need for understanding poverty before I conclude. I'm talking about some 40, 45 years ago when I was a young sub-collector in Parvatipuram, in the current Vijayanagaram, erstwhile Srikakulam district in the northeast of combined Andhra Pradesh. And Parvatipuram subdivision had some agency tracts, as we call them. They are hilly regions inhabited by tribal population. And tribals, as we know, are indebted. They're chronically indebted. They take money they borrow money from money lenders. And because of their inability to repay money, they lose their land, they lose their animals, and sometimes they get bonded to the money lender. But there is in Andhra Pradesh a very progressive legislation called the Debt Relief Act, Tribal Debt Relief Act. And it's remarkable for the clarity of purpose and the simplicity of process. What that regulation says is that all debt from a tribal to a non-tribal is null and void. Finished. So you'd still wonder, why are tribals indebted when there is such a progressive law on the statute book? So when I went there and I went to villages, I found that the tribals were indebted and they were losing money to the money lenders. And I said, oh, okay, my predecessors were very negligent people. They did not implement this regulation. Hero, come big hero, now I will implement the regulation. So I went around from one village to another saying that any tribal who is indebted, please come and petition to me. I will annul your debt. You'll be free of debt. 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, not one person came to me. Nobody. I was surprised that, look, there is such a progressive law on the statute books. Here I'm telling them that come to me and I will cancel your debt. Nobody is coming. And why? It dawned upon me afterwards that, okay, you go and cancel the debt of one tribal, but unless you give them alternate sources of borrowing, you're doing no good for them. In fact, you're doing bad to them. Because if one tribal goes to the sub-collector and gets his debt cancelled, the entire village is ostracized by the money lenders. They have no avenue or they have no access to credit. I did not understand this as a young fellow of 25 years. So it's very, very important. If you want to go towards New India, if you want to implement good governance for civil servants to understand the culture of poverty, and I hope that this book by Srinivas inspires all the young civil servants who are listening to this show, over 100 of them as I see, and many of them who are not listening who might see it afterwards, to understand the importance of understanding the culture of poverty. Srinivas says that the Niti Aayog said way back in 2017 or 2018 that by 2022, India will be a poverty-free India, dirt and scholar-free India, corruption-free India, terrorism-free India, caste-free India, communalism-free India. We are halfway past into 2020. It's just 1.5 years, less than 2 years to that date. We have to reflect on how close we are progressing. In fact, are we progressing or are we regressing from achieving those aspirations of poverty-free India, dirt and scholar-free India, corruption-free India, terrorism-free India, caste-free India, communism-free India. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much once again for this opportunity. Thank you, Srinivas. Congratulations once again for this book. And I'm sure that there are many more books on the way. I can't show you my bookshelf, but the book has a pride of place on my bookshelf, rest assured. And thank you. So may I now invite Girish Chaturvedi, my former colleague in the DEA, and now chairman of ICICI Bank with a distinguished background in the financial sector, to please comment on the book and on the author and on whatever else he wants to. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your introduction of the book and some of your own experiences. Uh, I will start with a little background about the author. He has already written something about it in his book, but I happen to know him from the period of 2003 when both of us were in the Ministry of Finance, and later on had another occasion to work together in the Ministry of Health. He was at that time mission director, NRHM, National Rural Health Mission in Rajasthan, and I was working in the government of India. And I had always considered him to be a person with very keen eye on the details, very deep thinker and very passionate person, who's practical also, a pragmatic administrator. And all these things are well reflected in the book itself. And currently, since he is in the Department of Personnel, so he is involved in good number of meetings which take place for the preparation of some of the policies. So in a few chapters, he had given those details. In other chapters, he had given the details of the policy, means final outcome. But there he had described some of the experiences of the beneficiaries. He had given the interviews of the persons who had implemented it or who are implementing it. So basically, that gives a lot of credence and credibility to what he has written. Uh, Basically, he has divided the book into 13 chapters, uh, each giving the details of the reform which has taken place in respective sector. We all know that we all started this journey in 1991, but that was the period when there was a crying need for reform. People were pining for it, and government resorted to them. They were, I should not say that they were low-hanging fruit, but those were the steps which were required to redeem the economy, and people accepted them. But later on, when the turn came for the second or third generation reform, people had started opposing it. So now, in fact, going deeper into the reform is a problem, because it's not something which the government should decide as a policy and people would accept it. Some of the reforms, which are really very soft in nature, require the change in the behavior of the community and people also. I would say a simple example like Swachh Bharat. Swachh Bharat is a reform which requires the change in the behavior of community and people. Their change in behavior for hygiene and sanitation is the requisite for implementing this reform in the true sense. So he has given the details of all those things, that how can really we influence the behavior of people, what are the steps which the government had taken really to inculcate the habit of hygiene and sanitation amongst people. For the other reforms which he had dealt with in his book, uh, like say Finance Commission or Niti Aayog or GST. Like GST is a really very, I would say, structural kind of a reform. And yes, this will change the scenario. One nation, one tax is a huge leap. Uh, the results are showing, but because of the calamity which has struck the whole globe, we are facing some problem. But this was one such thing which everybody was desiring to have in the country, and the government implemented it very successfully. Srinivas has very conveniently avoided some of the reforms which government undertook, but which they did not succeed. That's good. He has given only the ones which have succeeded. Some reforms like undertaken in November 2016, etc. Yes, but that's good, in fact, uh, so that people should know what has been undertaken and what has succeeded. In the health, since we were both together there, the reform was being undertaken from the year 2005. We were trying to carry them forward in the year 2008-9, the NRHM, which has now become NHM, the National Health Mission. From the rural, it has become the Health Mission. And uh, it is still going on. The COVID has changed the thinking further. So several components have been brought into the health reform policy based on our experience during this period. So this is an ongoing. In fact, for that matter, all the reforms is a continuous process. We cannot say that the reform has ended. There are certain things which will keep happening. And particularly in the health sector, the cooperation of public and private sector, and finally resulting into Ayushman Bharat uh, is the thing which had happened, and government had taken it up and trying to implement those reforms. Like say, take the case of chapter on education. Education was at that point in time when he would have been writing the book was work in progress. Now the National Education Policy 2020 has come out, and it has given several indicators of change. They are to be implemented. For rural development, yes, this we had been seeing as administrator from a very long time, say 1952, the community development days, till date, number of things had happened. Earlier, it was basically a community development. Now these things have zeroed in on individuals. Most of the schemes, except for Gram Sadak Yojana, all the other schemes, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Health Employment Guarantee, or you can say Awas Yojana, Prime Minister Awas Yojana, or Deen Dayal Upadhyay National Rural Livelihood Mission. All these schemes, they are individual centric. And it had been possible to reach to individuals because of another underlying reform which had taken place, and Srinivas had mentioned that in his book, is the Digital India reform, which had happened. And now the government, either in Ujjwala scheme or Prime Minister Awas Yojana, Urban, etc., is able to reach to the individual and transfer that amount to individual account. Again, as Dr. Subbarao had pointed out, this had been possible because of the financial inclusion reform which the government had undertaken. And through Janadhan, they could reach to the massive number of people. 14, 15 crores of account had been opened. And through this, the direct benefit transfer, either in the scheme of rural employment guarantee or fertilizer or LPG or any other subsidy for that matter, PDS subsidy, all these things had been possible because the person who's a beneficiary has an account in the bank, and the government of India transfers directly from here to his bank account. Srinivas has given the details of all these things in different chapters, and they have been basically highlighted so as to bring out the beneficial impact of the reform on individual. Other things like Skill India or Make in India, etc., they are still work in progress, I would say. But some of the social inclusion measures, culture, sports, fight against corruption, etc., they have all been mentioned. Again, I would say they are all work in progress. It takes a lot of time to change the behavior of the people and inculcate these things as a matter of habit. Another thing which he has brought out on the basis of his experience, I would say, is justice delivery system. As chairman of Board of Revenue of Rajasthan government, he had undertaken this reform, which he had described in greater detail. In fact, I would say in the book, some of the things had been given as the final product just for people to taste it. But there are certain things where he was involved himself. He has given the process also, that how he could arrive at these things and implement these reforms. This one chapter really gives in greater detail how he had arrived at the reform in the justice delivery system for the cases pending for longer time in the Board of Revenue of Rajasthan. This provides a lesson for reforms in this area. If suppose somebody wants to take away something, and applies to all the states. Basically, in all the states, a huge number of cases relating to revenue are lying without any final settlement. So this can be a challenge to the other state governments also to take and try to follow. In fact, in the end, he throws a kind of a challenge to the civil services. And I would say that what he had pointed out, improving the quality of service delivery, having very strong institutions in democracy, very robust database, and global perspective, combined with extensive use of information technology. These are the things which have to be there as a prerequisite for having good governance and having an important role for all the players in the system. I would say that when I read the title of the book, it struck me that Srinivas has left something for future, because this is 2014, 2019. It means he intends to write another book 2020 onwards. Otherwise, he will have to revise this book every year, because reform is an ongoing process and a number of chapters will have to be added in the revised edition. And basically, being there at a place where he is involved, he is observing, he is implementing some of the things, he is the best person to write about these things. Anybody who goes through the book will get a very good idea about how things happen in the government. So for administrators, this is one of the most recommended book, just to have an idea of what has happened during this period. And it gives a kind of a cue that how the government functions and what is going to happen in times to come. I feel that for policy planners too, this will be a good background material to see that how things can be carried forward. This is a very valuable contribution of Srinivas to the governance, and I would strongly recommend that those who are involved in implementation or policy planning should go through it. He has really made it very readable, very lucid. Otherwise, these things are very dry and drab in writing, and people normally use them as tranquilizer. But this one is the book written in such a style that you really intend to finish it. You are always interested that what's going to happen again in future. So I strongly recommend it for all those, and wish Srinivas all the best. And we'll wait for his next revised edition or another book on the same subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Girish, for those very perceptive comments drawing from your own experience. And I see that you covered as wide a canvas as Srinivas himself has covered in the book. And one thing I take away from what you've said, which is that the second and third generation reforms that we're implementing today are much more challenging than the first generation reforms that we took on in 1991. At that time, people used to say that reforms could be implemented just out of the local government. Today, reforms means you've got to carry the people with you. Now it's my pleasure and privilege to invite Sumita Dhabra to speak. Sumita, as Rajendra has said, is our colleague from the Andhra Pradesh cadre. She is an author of 2 very perceptive books herself. And I must also say that she's earned a formidable reputation here in Andhra Pradesh for her empathy, for understanding of the poor people, and for implementing good governance. So Sumita, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your kind words. I'm very honored. First of all, I must say I'm very honored to be part of this esteemed panel. And it's been a great pleasure to hear Subara Garu Chaturvedi on their views. Sir, it's also a privilege for me to be able to address the esteemed participants of this webinar here today. When I was first introduced to the writings of Srinivas Garu in August this year, what immediately struck me was the fact that he had published 2 well-researched books within a period of 12 months. And that was very impressive. And I could recognize that both the works were scholarly and written with diligence. Being a very busy civil servant, being able to achieve that, I thought was very prolific and a great achievement. I was very impressed by that. For the benefit of our participants, I'll just say a few words on his 2 books. His first book covers the topic of India's relations with the International Monetary Fund, and it gives 25 years in perspective from 1991 onwards, presented by the Indian Council of World Affairs. The book is truly well-researched and academic work, which fills an important gap in literature on the topic of India's relations with the IMF. His second book, which we are discussing here today, Towards a New India, Governance Transformed 2014-19, with a foreword by Bibek Debroy, the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. It's a comprehensive update on India's policy areas. It covers a vast canvas, as Subara Garu has observed. Diverse policy issues are presented with clarity, and their illustrations from the field. The areas covered, we have heard already the distinguished panelists. The areas covered are indeed very broad, the Digital India, the trinity of Jan Dhan Yojana, Ujjwala Yojana, the Prime Minister Awas Yojana, healthcare, education, rural development, Swachh Bharat, Skill India, Make in India, and many other topics, including our fight against corruption, improving justice systems. And what I was struck by again was the mature handling of the diverse issues. There's an easy handling of themes. And these are themes on policy which can actually be quite complex for the non-policy maker to keep track of. And this underlines the fact that the book truly deserves to be widely read by both experts and students alike. As a policymaker myself, a lot of our time is taken up by routine work and administrative matters, but I found the book to be a succinct and effective way to update myself on all that has happened in one of the most dynamic eras of policy evolution in India, 2014 to 19. As a civil servant with years of experience behind me, I truly believe that it is important to shape our shared understanding and learn from what is working on the ground and replicate success stories at scale. In his book, Towards a New India, Srinivas Garu has discussed the successful launch and implementation of over 100 of the government's path-breaking social welfare schemes. That is amazing. It is a remarkable repertoire of case studies to browse through and gain insights from. As the doyens who are with us here on the panel today, the great experience they have on financial issues, as they would agree, the true merit or impact of a scheme depends on the fiscal management and fiscal reform, which has been a hallmark of this era. Chapter 3, particularly on cooperative federalism, the author rightly notes that 2015 ushered in an era of India's fiscal federalism. And he's covered issues from the 14th Finance Commission recommending the highest ever devolution to the states, to reorientation of the Planning Commission becoming Niti Aayog, a think tank, and the shift to New India is further underlined by the rollout of the goods and services tax in July 2017. Similarly, one of the most significant characteristics of New India is Digital India, which is a campaign to transform India into a digitally empowered society and knowledge economy. To borrow from the book, digital is to the 21st century what industrial was in the 19th century. And in the same theme, Digital Aims project, which was implemented in 2015-16 by Srinivas Garu, when he was the Deputy Director of Aims of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. It's a very insightful case study where he was able to bring in systemic efficiency to deal with an overwhelming patient load. And this is a remarkable illustration of how simplification of a complicated hospital governance model could bring efficient service delivery, and patient-friendly hospitals were replicated. The model was replicated by other hospitals in the country as well. However, my two favorite pages from the book are the case example of Daughters Are Precious campaign, which was launched in Rajasthan in 2016 by the State Health Mission. And Srinivas Garu worked as Secretary of the Health Mission in Rajasthan on Saving the Girl campaign in 2008. And that converged with the launch of the campaign later on in Rajasthan with massive sensitization of the communities. It is very gratifying to note that the campaign led to an actual improvement in the sex ratio at birth for the year 2017-18. And based on the author's own experience, these are very powerful examples of the change that good governance can bring. I will take another 2 minutes to talk about Make in India, because that's an initiative which I personally am involved with at the DPIIT presently. It is heartening to see a whole chapter dedicated to Skill India, Make in India, success stories from the ground, Make in India being a campaign to foster a business environment to facilitate investments and manufacturing in the country. Investment proposals from major international companies in automobiles, electronics, clothing, furniture, retail are given in the book. And an example really pushes home the point that this has brought a sea change in the domestic manufacturing scenario. And of course, in the same chapter, I have a special place for the success story from Karimnagar and Mehboob Nagar. Having served in Karimnagar for 3 years and more as collector, I was very happy to see a mention of the district in his book. With more and more companies now coming into India under Make in India, and many more institutional reforms coming in, and government bringing in more incentives and digital initiatives in the form of the investment clearance cell, which we are putting together, or the GIS land bank, which is being put together, and the first phase has already been launched. We look forward to Government of India and all of us together taking things to the next level by focusing on the champion sectors under the Atmanirbhar Bharat. The book also has a unique question and answer format at the end of each chapter. And there are interviews with experts such as Mr. Govind Rao, who was associated with the 14th Finance Commission, with Professor Paul from Niti Aayog on Ayushman Bharat, and the optimism that shines through the book from the positive and inspiring examples truly makes the book very relevant for the younger generation of officers. I would just like to end with a few words on how this book brings to the table a much needed perspective, and administrators and implementers perspective, a personal perspective, a socially responsible perspective, which covers several complex policy areas. I wish him all the best and thank him for plugging an important gap in literature when it comes to New India initiatives. And one closes the book with the strong belief that New India is already on its way, marching well and truly achievable. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Sumita. That's very optimistic indeed that we are marching towards a New India. I hope we get there soon. I also want to appreciate the perceptiveness and intelligence that you brought to critique Srinivas's book. And we're pretty much on time, I see. And I now invite Srinivas to kindly recount his experience of writing the book and whatever else he has to say. On some advice to some prospective authors too, because you've been very prolific, as Sumita said.
Gauranilu Dubur Subbarao garu, Sri G.C. Chaturvedi ji, Srimati Sumita Dhabra garu, Sri Rajendra Nimje garu, Srimati Urmila Subbarao garu is participating in this webinar too. I first heard of Dr. Dubur Subbarao when I was 6 years old in 1972. My father was posted in a small village, Dumugudem, which was about 30 kilometers from Bhadrachalam, a village of less than 200 people. And he told me that Dubur Subbarao garu IAS top chesaru MSc Physics toti. That's what he told me. And I used to go to a panchayat school, and from there my memories come back when I first met him in 2003 in Washington, D.C. in his World Bank office. And I saw in him a man who inspired a generation of civil servants, a true genius amongst civil servants, one who has stood out, the man who has unflinchingly adhered to the RBI dharma. And he has left a vast imprint on my thinking, on my both my books, on the way I looked at service. And of course, there are several quotes of his that I have used in my book. In fact, in my address to the Rajasthan civil servants on Civil Services Day 2018, I did ask him what is the best message that I should take forward. And he said that commitment to larger public good against all odds. And even further, his own life has reinforced in me the importance of ethics and accountable civil service, and also strong institutions. And this is something that I took from him, from my years of watching him in service as a role model, and growing up with the ideology that here was a man who stood up for probity and for integrity in service. And today I take forward his thought that understanding poverty is a very important feature of governance. And this book emanates from the fact that I tried my best. I went to villages, did night halts in villages, slept in patwar ghars, did night halts in tehsil headquarters, the night halls in district headquarters and try to understand and interact with the citizens of India. And that is what led me to write this document. And I'm very grateful to him for this huge impact that he's had, not only in my writings, but also on my life in general. And I've greatly looked up to him. And today is one of the most significant days of my life that he has agreed to chair this session and say a few kind words about how much I looked up to him. Thank you very much, sir. Let me say a few words on GC Chaturvedi. I first met him when he came to Delhi from Uttar Pradesh. I think it was 2002 when he joined Finance Ministry as Joint Secretary Insurance. And we had a whole lot of Parliament questions to answer in those times, almost 20 questions every time a question day came. And there was also significant legislation that was pursued in that period, and Department of Banking was just established as an independent department in those years. Thereafter, we worked together in the National Health Mission, and main contributions has been to lay the foundation for the NRHM, a strong foundation for the NRHM. And as an officer handling the National Rural Health Mission in one of the largest states of India, I had the opportunity and privilege to interact with him almost on a daily basis in that period. And I think many of the ideas that he had laid down in that period were the precursor to the current day National Health Mission and, of course, the National Health Policy of 2017. I had the opportunity to travel extensively with Chaturvedi ji to grassroots level health institutions. He came and visited Rajasthan. In fact, it was a very long road trip that we undertook to the primary health centers, the community health centers, and the district hospitals in Dungarpur district. And he was quite amazed by what philanthropy could do in Dungarpur when a lot of Bohra community had actually built a hospital in one of the subdivisions at Dungarpur. And today, when I look back at the work that I could carry on in the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, or even in terms of Secretary Family Welfare and Mission Director NRHM, a lot of it has to do with the support that Chaturvedi ji has extended to me in those years. Sumita ji is a very senior civil servant. I'm grateful that she's here. In fact, when I read her book, The Field Experiences in Karimnagar, I was amazed that, that an officer could document 292 pages about her years as a district collector. In fact, my years as a district collector were very, very rushed, and it was difficult to document. It was also election years, but here I found an officer had committed herself to 3 years in a district and then documented it. Then I read her second book on China, and I also found that the experiences of visiting rural households, interaction with micro enterprises, interaction with school projects, it was quite intense, and the coverage and the discussion in terms of what Dr. Subbarao has defined as understanding poverty and how we combat poverty comes out very strongly. On this occasion, I'd like to thank my parents. My mother turns 80 today for instilling the values of national commitment and public service. My late wife, Satya, who always inspired me to travel these massive kilometers. In fact, I do remember temperatures in Rajasthan in that period used to be 50, 52 degrees. And she would say that just go out and serve. And in a period of 2 months in May, June 2018, I undertook a travel to something like 32 districts of the state. And she always insisted, as Chairman Board of Revenue, that spend every day trying to serve the people of the state and to your ultimate capacity. And that's what we did. And as I found, the impact on governance was quite significant with sustained hard work. This is my third book discussion on this subject, and I have been struck by how divergent individuals have looked at the chapters of the book. I take note that Dr. Subbarao today has emphasized on poverty alleviation. Shri G.C. Chaturvedi has emphasized on individual-centric reforms that were possible through the Digital India Initiative. In fact, the CEC was speaking about it a few days back, and he spoke about Skill India and improving justice delivery systems as the roadmap forward for a new India. The CEO of Niti Aayog said cooperative federalism was the right way to take it forward. And Health for All was another big initiative that a lot of people liked. And the CIC, Sudhir Bhargav, said that social inclusion measures and also India's fight against corruption were chapters that fascinated them. What fascinated me personally was the dynamism that young colleagues showed in the field. In fact, I'd like to mention a few officers whom I was particularly impressed with: Mugdha Sinha, Abhimanyu Kumar, Bhagwati Prasad, Piyush Samaria, Kushal Yadav, Samit Sharma, Bhavani Singh Deta. These were officers whom I have interviewed in the book, and I found their commitment levels were enormous. I'd also like to thank Professor Shefali and Professor Deepak Agarwal, who were there all through when the Digital Aims project was being implemented. And I distinctly recall Professor Shefali saying that the Titanic was sinking, and today we could save the Titanic once the online registration systems came into play. Let me also thank Dr. Rajan Nimje, the affable DG of CGG Hyderabad, for inviting me for the book discussion. He's an MTech in communication engineering and a fellow from Stanford University. I was quite amazed to see the contribution that you brought to the table in CGG Hyderabad. And let me conclude by saying that what Duvir Subbaragaru has told me many years ago, there are simply no shortcuts to success. And institutions rise and fall with individuals. And of course, this line that has stayed with me for some time, that the commitment to larger public good against all odds is the defining motto of civil servants. So let me thank all of you, sir, and also Sumita ji for being a part of this important day in my life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srinivas, for those comments. I appreciate the empathy and understanding with which you spoke. Exactly the traits that you reflected in the book as well. And that's what makes you a good IAS officer and a great communicator. So thank you very much for those comments. We have a few questions, and I think we also have time for another 15-20 minutes. So we will go through some of these questions. The first one is about, it's only appropriate that Srinivas takes the first question as the author. And this is about how the measures and structures put together as part of good governance could have made management of the pandemic much more effective. Can you draw from your experience in Rajasthan and speak to what could have been done better, and what have been the strong points, and what have been the weaknesses in India's management of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sir, I've had the opportunity to interact with more than 300 district collectors across India in this period of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I find tales of tremendous sacrifice, young officers putting service above self, standing up for the nation, and devoting enormous amount of man hours to enable the systems to stand up. They were the frontline COVID warriors in many ways, mobilizing huge teams to fight the pandemic. And what struck me in every village was the manner, in every district was the manner in which technology was leveraged to fight the pandemic. People used several surveillance measures like digital surveillance, zero surveillance, thermal scanning. They also used a series of apps. In fact, Karnataka used more than 24 apps, including the eSanjeevani app, the Arogya Setu app, and people actually reached out, and the manner in which they mobilized themselves. There were young collectors like Kirti Jali of Assam who went and attended cremations to ensure that protocols were maintained with great rigidity. People were there to ensure that new hospitals were created, capacity building measures of nurses, of first responders, of frontline workers was undertaken. They ensured that food distribution was on track. If there's one standout feature of governance in this period, it is the manner in which India's district collectors have stood up to fight this battle. That was something that stands out with me.
Thank you, Srinivas. But and this is a related question on which you are quite a bit of an expert. So is Girish Chaturvedi. This is about the National Health Mission. What worked and what did not, and what can be done to improve it, particularly in situations like today when we're confronted with a gigantic pandemic. Maybe Girish, you want to take this on, since you are an expert on NRHM and now NHM.
Sir, in fact, I'll make a brief comment about
Sure.
the earlier one also and clubbing it with that.
Right.
In fact, I think Srinivas will also vouch for it. Our experiences of the health and family welfare days convinced us that the situation in which our society is, particularly the distribution of wealth, etc., uneven distribution, and it is going to be there for fair amount of time in future also. There is no substitute of public sector health facilities, no substitute. So in fact, when we move little faster towards the privatization of health facilities, I'm at times little shocked that, and which has happened, which has been shown so clearly during the pandemic. It is the public health facilities which had worked and which had delivered whatever Srinivas described. It was the district collector, district machinery, etc., all relating to the government, which had really delivered to whatever extent they could. But there is no substitute of it, and we should not just try to weaken it. We must strengthen, and that is what we were trying to do under National Rural Health Mission, trying to strengthen the public health facilities, starting from A&M up to the district hospital, which is a secondary healthcare unit, and the tertiaries will take care of it. Mostly the private hospitals are there in tertiary sector. They are not interested in coming into the primary sector at all, and to a lesser extent in the secondary, because that is where the crowd is. And apart from it, sir, we also felt during that period a reform in the medical education too. If suppose somebody in fact passes out an MBBS or MD or MS after paying 1 crore, 2 crore, 2.5 crore, we should not expect a social service from him when he joins the profession. He has to earn some money to really repay whatever debt, bank, etc. So there is no substitute for government medical colleges also. We have to really strengthen it. We have to strengthen public health facilities. That is the way we can move forward to the masses here. A certain section can take care of itself, but the others, particularly rural area, they still depend upon the public health facilities. That's my perception about things. So I would say we must move ahead.
Just one point to add on that, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Rajendra.
Yeah, what Chaturvedi sir was saying is absolutely right. What we have seen here in the pandemic, and how day by day, because every day we were coming to office and then monitoring, and then of course, in the whether it is epidemic or any kind of calamity, the civil servants work, I think, at very high efficiency. That's what I've seen in all my period during calamities. I just want to add on this health side. What I have perceived is this, particularly the telemedicine, which was taking roots, and later it has not taken a very deep root, which I can see now, because government side connectivity between the primary and secondary also through telemedicine is possible. That has not happened. So I think this kind of thing and the reforms going forward, if the government works on it and then include maybe the private sector also in such a way blending, it will be a big boon, because we are seeing the benefits now in pandemic time. Telemedicine is saving so many people. They are suffering with mental issues also on top of it. So I think this is just one small point I thought will be going forward useful.
No,
I fully agree, Mr. Rajan. Fully agree. Yes.
Yeah.
Right, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Girish, and thank you, Rajendra, for those responses. That's a very clear message, because for several decades, we've been running down our public health delivery system, but how it is ground to a halt under its decade, and poor people have to depend on private medical services for everything. That is forced to go to the private medical. And now your message that we have to pay attention, especially for primary healthcare delivery, on the government medical services, and indeed the effectiveness of our health outcomes will depend on how effectively we strengthen that delivery system. That's very important. I'm also glad that you mentioned about government medical colleges, which is not something that people who do not have expertise from the medical and health sector understand. Thank you for those responses. Now let me move on to another question, which is about, this is somewhat garbled, but the way I understand the question is that reforms initiated by the central or state government are based mostly on the perception of individual political ideologies. And there is no effort to communicate the intent behind reforms, and there is no intent or there is no effort to carry the people with the reforms. What can be done to carry the vast majority of the people in with the reforms? Sumita, you want to take that on from your experience both in Andhra Pradesh, UNICEF, and now in Government of India?
Sir, if I could understand the question correctly, it's about reforms being taken forward.
It's about reforms being taken forward, but more particularly about what can be done to get popular support for reform, particularly in today's context, for example, about the farm bills, etc. What could have been done, for example, differently by the government to get popular support for it?
Sir, if I dip into my own experience and working extensively in the field with communities, I think the best way is always to educate and create awareness, involve the local leaders, the local communities, the stakeholders, stakeholder consultations, and create an environment of better understanding, bringing everybody on board, and a very inclusive dialogue, which helps in proper foundation for taking reform forward. So that is what my experience taught me, particularly my work in Andhra Pradesh and other areas. So that would be my very brief response to this.
Very good. Thank you very much. I want to supplement what you've said, which is that generating popular support for reforms is the prerogative, responsibility, and the job of politicians. The civil servants are there to advise the politicians, and the civil service is there to implement those reforms. And if in the course of implementation, some problems arise or some challenges are encountered, I believe it is the responsibility of the civil service to tweak the reforms, to tweak the schemes, to tweak the policies, to see that the larger public good is secured. So I would say that the primary responsibility of generating support for reforms is with the politicians, but the civil service have to support the politicians in generating that support. Okay. Again, this is a very omnibus question about, we talked about it actually, which is about what can civil servants do for the success or failure of reforms, especially the do's and don'ts. We talked about it. In fact, if you want to talk about do's and don'ts of civil servants in the process of reforms, that becomes a separate panel discussion in itself. So we will move on to other questions. Drawing from your experience of 3 years in China, Dhabra madam, could you speak briefly to the opportunity that India is trying to leverage, especially economic opportunities? Sumita, that's for you.
It's not a very, yes, it's not a very simple answer, sir. And I had to write a book of almost 300 pages to be able to explain that. But I would say there are a lot of opportunities coming our way, and we are already leveraging those And we need to go, certainly we need to go a long way to leverage on these opportunities. And like I mentioned, some of the initiatives, especially in the pandemic, when investors are not able to, we are not able to do outreach properly and investors are not able to visit us for site visits, it becomes very important to have the digital platforms of single window system for clearances and the GIS land bank, where an investor sitting anywhere in the country can see where he can come into a good industrial park, these kind of initiatives. It's very important to attract investments, both domestic and foreign, so that we can make use of our resources, the human resources, the natural resources, and particularly the clusters where manufacturing has already come up. And we need to bring in the supply chains, which are looking at diversifying now into other parts of the world. So there are great opportunities and we do need to leverage on them quickly. Thank you, sir.
I want to supplement on that, and since I'm no longer in the government, I can reflect on that with more expansively. China is a lot different from India. We are a vigorous democracy. We cannot implement reforms, as we discussed earlier, unless there is popular support for them, and we encourage people to express their views. This is a free society. China is a lot different, both in terms of their political organization and their administrative structures. But there are lots of things that we can learn from China. Way back about 20, 25 years ago, I used to be involved in industrial development in Andhra Pradesh. And subsequently too, as Finance Secretary here in Andhra Pradesh and Finance Secretary in Delhi, I interacted with a number of both domestic and foreign investors, especially foreign investors. They would come to Hyderabad or to Delhi and they say, look, we want to invest $5 billion in Uttar Pradesh or in Maharashtra or in Kerala. And we're looking at China as well, which went to Shanghai and just come back. And we spoke to the Chinese authorities and they said they'll give us all this land, water, utilities, et cetera, in 6 months. And so we look at them and say, oh, I see, okay, Chinese said 6 months. We will give all of them to you in 3 months. And same investors come back after 6 months. India, what is promised to deliver in 3 months will not deliver even in 3 years. What China has promised to deliver in 6 months will deliver in less than 3 months. So that, for us, because we're all engaged in governance, and I expect the audience to, in mostly civil servants, I think we must reflect on this, about why we're not able to deliver on many of our promises. The ease of doing business. We've jumped 50 places in the World Bank's ease of doing business ranking, and that's remarkable. That's very creditable. But yet, we hear stories every week, every month about potential investors frustrated, angry, annoyed, worried, anxious about their investment because they do not get support from the front lines. So it's not enough that if we move up the ease of doing business index, we must look at our entire administrative delivery system and see where we are failing. We must have good policies in Delhi. We must have good policies in state capital like Hyderabad or Mumbai or Bangalore or Lucknow. But it's very, very important that we have implementation of those policies at the frontier. So we'll have maybe one more question. Let me see. Yeah, the administrative and business processes in Indian government and state governments are quite old and obsolete. Some of them dating back to the Mughal period. It's a long question, but what can be done using information technology to improve our governance? I think this is a question straight headed for Rajendra, so I'd let you handle that first. But how can you leverage on technology to improve governance? I know Srinivas's book has spoken about it, but we want to hear from you, your own experience, both while you were in the field and now in the Center for Good Governance. Can you hear me, Rajan?
Yes, sir.
Okay, go ahead.
Question actually, they're it's talking about the whole gamut of governance. So definitely what I can add is, over as Chaturvedi sir has said, the first generation reforms, second generation reforms, and like that. So we have moved along. I think the for first maybe last in 20 years, first 15 years, it was maybe in a slow process. But if you really see the kind of digital acceleration, the accessibility of the information, the rules which you can, just for getting the information, we used to wait, people used to wait. And now the whole gamut has changed. Almost all governments in India, state governments as well as government of India, has streamlined the process. They made it accessible. Now the next generation is, how do we continue these kind of processes in a practical way? What we found, for example, is when we invite the people in a kind of industrial promotion and all, with a lot of fanfare, the state governments call them and then say maybe land allotment, this, that they promise. But the follow-up kind of thing is very difficult. So that kind of things has to be the next generation, I can say, the follow-up at each stage digitally, because now the tools are available. Like we are now chatting in COVID period, and still we can reach a large amount of relevant masses. So that is a digital transformation. How do we leverage it in various sectors? I think that is the key. And primary, again, the major tool, like even after putting so many years of service, I still feel that education and health sector, which we talk about, has really not come to a level where it is a level playing field or it is accessible to the general public in the way which we wanted. I think lot has to be done, and we must leverage the technology. Like under this compulsion, people are reaching out saying that the classes are conducted. Now we are talking, earlier we used to talk about digital divide. Now there is a different kind of digital divide on the accessibility of devices and internet connectivity and all. But people are overcoming in a very innovative way. I think that is the key, which happens, innovation happens in a private sector. It is started coming in a big way. And even our district collectors, which once in a while used to come, a story which used to read, or now the DRPG only has, volumes of kind of stories. If those kind of things shared, reach the masses and implementers, I think we'll have a digital revolution. I'm very sure our country will take over in this sense, because we are open kind of society, and this kind of revolution makes a lot to us. That's what I want to say.
Thank you, Rajendra. And the final question, which I want to answer, because the question was directed to me, is what really surprised you during the pandemic? I'm really thinking on my feet now. But what surprised me most of all is the resilience of our people. We are a poor country. We are the poorest in the G20. We are the poorest among the BRICS countries. There are more poor people in India than the entire continent of Africa put together. But in spite of that, I was impressed by the unfolding of the pandemic, how poor people across the country, from our cities in the reverse migration, braving heat, braving thirst, braving hunger, they moved back. Poor people in the villages across India, 600,000 villages, they withstood the intensity of the pandemic, and even as we speak today, they're withstanding the intensity and attack of this pandemic. So the resilience of the Indian people is what surprised me. And I was also, this is not a very, and I must get it right when I communicate it, which is that in spite of all this reverse migration of millions of people from cities to villages across the country, even as much as they endured enormous pain and hardship, heat, dust of the country, we've not seen mass starvation like we probably would have seen 15 or 20 years ago. And that's a remarkable achievement. That is an achievement not just of this government, that's an achievement of successive governments over the last 7 or 8 decades since our independence. That today we've achieved a certain level of security for our people, that we are able to withstand such a grave tragedy. That surprised me also. So I will stop there. I want to thank all the panelists, and I want to hand over to Srinivas finally, if you want to say anything before we close the session.
I think you've covered it all, sir. Thank you very much for this very special day. And let me thank all the panelists.
And thank you. And please convey our best wishes to your mother on this very happy birthday. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining, and particularly Srinivas sir to give us this opportunity to host this session today. And Subarav sir, Chaturvedi sir, it's a pleasure to listen to you and participate in this kind of webinar. Sumita madam also. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Ram.
Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.